Isolation increases survival chances not because it makes a place invincible, but because it quietly removes it from the center of attention when the world's most destructive weapons are unleashed. In a nuclear war, the first and most decisive factor is targeting, and targeting is driven by value. Large cities, dense populations, military headquarters, industrial centers, ports, and communication hubs are seen as valuable. Remote areas, by contrast, offer very little strategic return. When decision-makers select targets, they focus on places whose destruction will cripple command structures, manufacturing capacity, and morale. Isolation, therefore, becomes a form of invisibility. Low population density dramatically reduces the likelihood of a direct strike. A nuclear weapon is not used casually, it is chosen to achieve maximum impact with a single detonation. Hitting a sparsely populated region wastes that potential. This means that isolated states, mountain towns, and rural interiors often sit far down the priority list. Even if a nation is attacked on a massive scale, not every square mile will be targeted. Vast, quiet regions are often bypassed simply because they are not worth the cost. Isolation also reduces secondary damage. Even if a nuclear explosion occurs hundreds of miles away, the effects weaken with distance. The shockwave loses force, thermal radiation fades, and structural damage becomes minimal. People living far from urban centers are less likely to suffer from collapsed buildings, fires, and infrastructure failures caused by blast pressure. In isolated regions, homes are often spread out, constructed differently, and surrounded by open land, which further limits cascading destruction. Another advantage of isolation is reduced exposure to chaos. In densely populated areas, survival quickly becomes a competition for limited resources. Panic, overcrowding, and breakdown of order can be as deadly as radiation itself. Isolated communities experience fewer mass evacuations, less strain on food and water supplies, and a lower risk of violence triggered by desperation. Distance from major highways and urban corridors can slow the spread of unrest, giving people time to adapt rather than react. Isolation also shapes mindset. Communities that live far from major cities often rely more on local resources and personal skills. While this does not make them immune to disaster, it does make them less dependent on fragile systems. When power grids fail, fuel supplies stop, and national logistics collapse, isolated populations may already be accustomed to backup methods, seasonal planning, and self-sufficiency. This cultural resilience can be as important as physical safety. Environmental factors further strengthen the value of isolation. Many remote regions are surrounded by natural buffers such as mountains, forests, or open plains that help disperse fallout rather than trap it. Fewer concrete surfaces and tall structures mean less radioactive material clinging to urban debris. Cleaner airflows and lower industrial pollution can also reduce the concentration of radioactive particles settling in one place. While isolation does not eliminate radiation risk, it often reduces its intensity and duration. Perhaps most importantly, isolation buys time. Time to understand what has happened, time to avoid exposure, time to make rational decisions rather than panicked ones. In a nuclear scenario, minutes matter near the blast zone, but days and weeks matter everywhere else. Those who are far away are not forced into immediate life or death choices. They can observe, assess, and respond with caution. In the end, isolation does not guarantee survival, but it shifts the odds. It removes people from the center of destruction, reduces the scale of immediate threats, and limits the social collapse that follows mass casualties. In a world where modern warfare targets importance, visibility, and concentration, being remote is no longer a disadvantage. It becomes a quiet form of protection, turning forgotten places into unexpected refuges when everything else is falling apart.
В третьем эпизоде напряжение вокруг Покровска стало ощущаться почти физически. Воздух над городом словно был пропитан тревогой, и каждый новый день начинался не с утреннего света, а с попытки понять, где именно ночью были слышны взрывы и какие районы пострадали сильнее. Военные подразделения, остававшиеся на позициях, все чаще сталкивались с тем, что привычные схемы снабжения переставали работать. Грузы приходили с опозданием, иногда не приходили вовсе, а то, что удавалось доставить, распределялось почти поштучно. Это заставляло командиров пересматривать планы, откладывать некоторые операции и сосредотачиваться лишь на самом необходимом – удержании ключевых точек и защите путей возможной эвакуации гражданских. Солдаты рассказывали, что главным врагом стала не только внешняя угроза, но и усталость. Постоянное напряжение, ночные дежурства, короткий сон в холодных укрытиях и понимание, что смена может не прийти вовремя, постепенно подтачивали моральное состояние. Разговоры в перерывах все чаще касались дома, семьи, обычной жизни, которая теперь казалась чем-то далеким и почти нереальным. Тем не менее, даже в этих условиях сохранялась дисциплина, каждый знал, что его участок важен для общей линии обороны, и что от его внимательности может зависеть безопасность других. В 4-м эпизоде все больше внимания стало уделяться попыткам найти варианты для частичного вывода сил и ротации подразделений. Но любые такие планы упирались в суровую реальность. Дороги, которые на карте выглядели как возможные маршруты отхода, на практике оказывались простреливаемыми, с поврежденным покрытием и завалами. Иногда разведка сообщала о коротких промежутках относительного затишья, но за эти несколько часов нужно было успеть слишком многое: подготовить колонны, проверить технику, предупредить подразделения, обеспечить прикрытие. Малейшая задержка могла сорвать весь замысел. Внутри города жизнь мирных жителей тоже все больше подчинялась этим же ритмам тревоги и ожидания. Люди учились быстро спускаться в укрытие, заранее держать собранные сумки с документами и лекарствами, а также поддерживать друг друга простыми словами и делами. Кто-то делился последними запасами еды, кто-то помогал пожилым соседям добраться до подвалов. В таких мелочах проявлялась удивительная способность людей сохранять человечность даже тогда, когда вокруг рушится привычный порядок. Чем дольше длилось противостояние, тем отчетливее становилось ощущение, что Покровск превратился в узел, где сходятся не только дороги, но и судьбы. Для военных это был сложный участок фронта, требующий максимальной концентрации и выдержки. Для мирных жителей – место, которое одновременно было домом и зоной постоянной опасности. И в этих условиях сам вопрос о выходе или отходе переставал быть простым тактическим решением и превращался в тяжелый выбор между риском, временем и человеческими жизнями, который приходилось делать снова и снова.
Distance from strategic targets matters because nuclear warfare is not random destruction, it is calculated violence aimed at breaking a nation's ability to function. Military planners focus on places that matter most to command, control, production, and movement. These include major cities, military bases, ports, airfields, missile silos, communication hubs, and industrial centers. The farther a location is from these high-value targets, the less likely it is to be deliberately struck, and the weaker the indirect effects become. In a nuclear conflict, distance quietly reshapes fate. Strategic targets are chosen to create maximum impact with minimum weapons. A single strike on a dense urban or military center can cripple infrastructure, kill leadership, disrupt logistics, and spread fear across an entire nation. Remote areas offer none of these advantages. Destroying them changes little in terms of military balance or political pressure. As a result, places far from strategic value often fall outside the primary targeting plans, especially during the first and most devastating wave of attacks. Distance also reduces exposure to immediate physical effects. Nuclear explosions produce extreme blast pressure, heat, and radiation, but these forces weaken rapidly as they travel outward. Cities and bases near the detonation zone suffer catastrophic damage, while areas dozens or hundreds of miles away may experience little more than shockwaves or distant flashes. Being far from strategic targets often means being far from ground zero, and that separation can be the difference between instant destruction and survivable disruption. Equally important is distance from secondary targets. Modern warfare relies on interconnected systems. When a major city or base is hit, surrounding regions often suffer indirectly through power failures, fuel shortages, and transportation collapse. However, the farther a community is from these hubs, the less tightly it is bound to their failure. Distance weakens the chain reaction of collapse. Roads may be fewer, but dependency is also lower. This isolation limits how far chaos spreads. Fallout patterns further emphasize the importance of distance. Radioactive particles are most dangerous near the detonation site and along predictable wind corridors downwind of major targets. Communities far from these zones are less likely to experience heavy fallout concentrations. While no place is completely immune, distance increases the chance that radiation levels will be lower, more dispersed, and shorter-lived. This difference can define long-term survivability rather than immediate survival alone. Distance also affects human behavior. After strikes on strategic centers, mass panic and displacement follow. Millions attempt to flee cities, overwhelming highways, resources, and emergency systems. Regions close to major targets often become transit zones for refugees, increasing pressure, conflict, and instability. Areas far from strategic locations are less likely to be flooded by sudden population movements, allowing communities to remain more stable and controlled during the critical aftermath. There is also a psychological dimension to distance. Living near a known military base or major city means living with the constant expectation of being targeted. In contrast, remote regions may experience uncertainty, but not immediate terror. This psychological space allows for clearer thinking and measured decisions rather than frantic reactions. In extreme crises, calm often becomes as valuable as supplies. Strategic distance matters long before any missile is launched. Nations invest heavily in defending key locations, but they cannot protect everything equally. Defensive systems are concentrated around high-value assets, confirming their importance and, paradoxically, their danger. Areas without such defenses are often ignored not because they are weak, but because they are strategically insignificant. In nuclear planning, insignificance can be a form of protection. Ultimately, distance from strategic targets does not guarantee safety, but it reshapes probability. It lowers the chance of direct attack, reduces the severity of indirect effects, and limits exposure to cascading social and infrastructural collapse. In a war defined by precision and priorities, survival is often determined not by strength or readiness, but by how far one stands from the places the world considers most important. Wind patterns and climate play a decisive role in determining who faces the deadliest effects of a nuclear strike and who avoids them, because radioactive fallout does not simply fall straight down. After a nuclear explosion, massive clouds of radioactive debris are lifted high into the atmosphere, where they are carried by prevailing winds for hundreds or even thousands of miles. The direction, speed, and consistency of those winds often matter more than distance alone. Two places equally far from a blast can experience vastly different outcomes depending on how the atmosphere moves. In much of the United States, prevailing winds generally move from west to east. This means that regions located east or downwind of major targets are more likely to receive heavier fallout, while areas upwind often receive significantly less. Fallout is most dangerous when it settles in dense concentrations, contaminating soil, water, and food sources. Wind direction determines where those concentrations form. Regions that sit outside dominant wind corridors gain a natural advantage, not because they escape radiation entirely, but because exposure levels may be lower and more dispersed. Climate stability also matters. Areas with consistent wind patterns allow fallout models to be predicted with greater accuracy, which can influence both targeting strategies and survival outcomes. Unstable or turbulent weather systems tend to spread radioactive particles more widely, reducing concentration but increasing geographic reach. While this sounds worse, lower concentration over a larger area is often less deadly than intense contamination in one zone. Regions with dynamic air movement may avoid the worst-case scenarios of heavy fallout saturation. Rainfall plays a complex role. Rain can pull radioactive particles out of the atmosphere and deposit them rapidly on the ground, a phenomenon often referred to as radioactive washout. In areas with frequent heavy rainfall shortly after a detonation, fallout can become more concentrated in localized spots, increasing danger. Conversely, regions with lighter or infrequent rainfall may see fallout remain airborne longer, allowing it to disperse further and thin out before settling. Climate, therefore, determines not just where radiation goes, but how intensely it affects a given place. Temperature layers in the atmosphere further shape fallout behavior. Cooler air near the ground and warmer air above can trap particles, slowing their descent or redirecting their movement. Mountain regions and northern climates often experience complex air layering that disrupts smooth fallout travel. This can reduce prolonged exposure compared to flat, warm regions where air moves more uniformly. Climate complexity adds uncertainty, and uncertainty often lowers concentration peaks that cause the greatest harm. Seasonal patterns are another factor. In winter months, snow can temporarily trap radioactive material, preventing immediate contamination of soil and water. While this does not eliminate danger, it can delay exposure and provide time for decay, since radiation weakens over time. In contrast, dry, windy seasons can spread contamination across farmland and urban areas quickly, increasing long-term consequences. Climate determines whether fallout settles slowly or aggressively reshapes the environment. Wind patterns also influence strategic planning itself. Military planners understand atmospheric behavior and consider it when selecting targets. Strikes are often planned to avoid sending fallout into friendly or neutral regions while maximizing impact on adversaries. This means some areas are unintentionally spared because winds would carry radioactive material in undesirable directions. Climate and wind, in this sense, quietly shape human decisions long before any weapon is launched. For survivors, the long-term impact of fallout depends on how deeply radioactive particles penetrate ecosystems. Regions with strong winds and active weather cycles may cleanse surfaces faster, while stagnant climates allow radiation to linger. Over time, wind and climate determine how quickly an area recovers or remains hazardous. These forces decide whether land becomes unusable for generations or slowly returns to habitability. In the end, wind and climate do not choose sides, but they decide outcomes. They carry invisible dangers across borders, shape zones of devastation, and spare others almost by accident. In a nuclear conflict, survival is influenced not only by where explosions occur, but by how the air moves afterward. The sky itself becomes a silent force, redistributing destruction and quietly determining which places face prolonged suffering and which are given a chance to endure. Self-reliant communities are more resilient in a nuclear crisis because survival does not end with avoiding the blast, it begins with enduring the aftermath. When modern systems collapse, the difference between survival and failure often depends on how dependent people are on centralized infrastructure. Communities that already rely on local skills, shared responsibility, and practical knowledge adapt faster and suffer less shock when outside support disappears. In highly urbanized areas, daily life depends on invisible systems working perfectly. Electricity powers communication, refrigeration, water pumps, and medical equipment. Fuel deliveries keep food moving. Digital networks coordinate everything from banking to emergency response. When a nuclear strike disrupts these systems, cities can become unlivable within days. Self-reliant communities, by contrast, are used to operating with fewer layers of dependency. Power outages, supply delays, and isolation may be challenging, but they are not unfamiliar. Food security is one of the strongest advantages of self-reliance. Rural and semi-rural communities often have direct access to agriculture, livestock, hunting, fishing, or stored supplies. They understand seasonal cycles and preservation methods such as drying, smoking, and canning. When supply chains break, these skills become essential. In contrast, populations dependent on daily deliveries face immediate shortages and competition. The ability to produce or secure food locally reduces panic and conflict, two forces that can be as deadly as radiation exposure. Water access is another critical factor. Self-reliant regions are more likely to draw water from wells, springs, lakes, or local systems rather than long, complex pipelines. When centralized treatment plants fail or become contaminated, communities with independent water sources gain a significant survival advantage. Knowledge of filtration, boiling, and conservation becomes vital. These are skills often practiced already in remote or rural life, not learned in desperation. Medical resilience also differs. While rural areas may lack advanced hospitals, they often compensate with practical first aid knowledge, improvisation, and community care. In a nuclear aftermath, hospitals in cities are likely to be overwhelmed or destroyed. Access to professional care becomes limited everywhere. Communities that can treat injuries, manage infections, and care for the vulnerable without relying entirely on advanced technology stand a better chance of stabilizing their population over time. Social structure plays a powerful role. Self-reliant communities tend to be smaller and more interconnected. People know one another, share labor, and coordinate informally. Trust matters when resources are limited. In large populations, anonymity can fuel fear, hoarding, and violence. In close-knit communities, cooperation becomes a survival strategy. Shared responsibility reduces the likelihood of collapse from internal conflict. Psychological resilience is another advantage. People accustomed to hardship, weather extremes, and isolation often develop patience and problem-solving skills. They are less likely to panic when conditions worsen suddenly. Panic leads to poor decisions, dangerous exposure, and unnecessary conflict. Calm, even under extreme stress, allows for planning, rationing, and adaptation. This mental resilience can determine whether a community stabilizes or disintegrates. Self-reliance also limits dependence on external authority during chaos. In a nuclear scenario, national coordination may be delayed or fragmented. Emergency responses prioritize major population centers, leaving remote areas largely on their own. Communities that expect to solve problems locally are not paralyzed by the absence of immediate guidance. They act, adjust, and endure. Over time, recovery favors those who can sustain themselves while the wider system rebuilds. Radiation levels decrease, supply lines slowly return, and governance re-emerges, but only for those still functioning when that happens. Self-reliant communities are more likely to reach that point. They may not escape hardship, but they avoid total collapse. Ultimately, resilience is not about strength or technology, it is about adaptability. In a nuclear crisis, the most valuable resource is not weapons or wealth, but the ability to live with less, cooperate under pressure, and survive without guarantees. Communities that already embody these traits turn uncertainty into endurance, proving that survival is as much social and cultural as it is physical. Survival in a nuclear war is less about strength, wealth, or advanced technology and more about location, because modern warfare targets concentration, importance, and visibility rather than individuals. Power attracts attention. Major cities, political capitals, military headquarters, industrial zones, and economic centers represent influence and control, which makes them the first objectives in a nuclear exchange. The places that matter most in peacetime often become the most dangerous places in wartime. History and strategy both show that destructive power is applied where it produces the greatest effect. Nuclear weapons are not designed to chase every person, they are designed to break systems. Governments, economies, communication networks, and transportation hubs are the real targets. Living near these centers means living near danger, regardless of personal strength or preparedness. No amount of wealth or technology can protect someone who is positioned at ground zero or inside a major fallout corridor. Location determines exposure long before any individual action becomes relevant. A person in a remote, strategically insignificant area may survive simply because nothing happens nearby. Another person with superior resources, planning, and influence may not survive because their location places them at the center of destruction. This imbalance reveals a harsh truth. Survival is often decided before the first decision is made, based purely on geography and strategic value. Power also creates dependency. Highly developed areas rely on dense infrastructure networks that function only when everything works together. Electricity, digital communication, fuel distribution, water treatment, and food logistics are all interconnected. When nuclear strikes disrupt these systems, powerful regions collapse quickly because their complexity becomes a weakness. In contrast, less powerful regions with simpler systems may continue functioning at a basic level, not because they are stronger, but because they are less fragile. Location shapes the scale of chaos that follows a strike. In powerful centers, panic spreads rapidly due to population density and resource competition. Evacuation routes clog, supplies disappear, and social order deteriorates under pressure. Even those who avoid direct harm face secondary threats from unrest, shortages, and breakdown of authority. In less significant locations, the absence of mass panic can be as protective as distance from the blast itself. There is also a psychological illusion tied to power. People often believe that advanced defenses, wealth, or national importance provide safety. In reality, these qualities increase risk. Missile defense systems, hardened facilities, and strategic importance signal value to an adversary. They confirm that a location matters enough to be targeted. Places without such markers may appear weak, but weakness in strategic terms often equals irrelevance, and irrelevance can mean survival. Location influences long-term outcomes as well. Areas that avoid direct strikes and heavy fallout recover faster, regardless of their pre-war status. Land remains usable, water sources remain cleaner, and populations remain stable enough to rebuild. Meanwhile, once powerful regions may take generations to recover due to contamination, infrastructure loss, and population displacement. Power does not guarantee recovery, location shapes the possibility of it. Even global politics reinforces this reality. In nuclear planning, not all areas are treated equally. Limited arsenals, targeting priorities, and escalation control mean that some regions will always be spared, not out of mercy, but out of calculation. Those regions are rarely the centers of power. They are the margins, the peripheries, the overlooked spaces that suddenly matter most to the people living there. Ultimately, survival in a nuclear conflict is not a reward for strength or preparation alone. It is an outcome shaped by where one stands in relation to the systems the world values most. Location defines risk, exposure, and aftermath. Power draws fire. Distance creates opportunity. In a war designed to destroy importance itself, being unimportant can become the greatest advantage of all.